Hi, everyone. Welcome to Shamelessly Relevant, a podcast where we have conversations with the LGBTQ community.
We're your hosts. I'm Elena Burge. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm pansexual and poly.
My name is Julie Blunt. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm queer.
Joining us today is Hannah Asuncion, our DEI editor, and Will Duvall, a DEI staffer and our LGBTQ plus beat writer. Can you guys introduce yourself?
Yes, of course. My name is Hannah. I am the DEI editor. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm queer.
And then, hey guys, my name's Will Duvall. I'm the DEI staffer, and I'm also the LGBTQ plus beat writer. My pronouns are he, him, and I am pansexual.
Awesome. So today we're going to be talking about the concept of queerbaiting. So a quick definition of queerbaiting is this term refers to the practice of implying like non-heterosexual relationships or attraction, typically in TV, film, to engage or attract an LGBTQ plus audience or otherwise generate interest without ever actually depicting such relationships or sexual interactions. For example, a TV show may be accused of queerbaiting when interactions between two same-sex characters are consistently suggestive of sexual attraction or a sexual relationship, but the characters never actually enter into a relationship, including and especially when their sexuality isn't otherwise discussed or portrayed.
So some examples of this could be Supernatural. The characters Dean and Castiel or Cass are constantly seen as in a relationship together. The fandom ships them together, but it's never explicitly said that that character or those characters are bisexual or whatever. Another example is like in Pitch Perfect, Becca and Chloe several times are, kind of hinted at being in a lesbian relationship, but it's never stated.
Yeah, people took issue with a lot of these implied relationships because writers and producers consciously include these hints and allusions to queer relationships, but when they're asked about like ships and relationships like that, they deny them, and oftentimes they'll laugh at the characters being queer and kind of make the audience feel gaslit, like, oh, you expected that to be a queer relationship? Like, we would never actually do that. And this is especially problematic with queer relationships because it's used to draw queer audiences, often for financial gain and marketing techniques.
Some examples are more obvious than others, but there's debate surrounding certain pieces of media, kind of between the line of queerbaiting and telling queer stories without overly admitting it. For example, Pixar film Luca, that one was talked about a lot when it first came out because a lot of people were saying it was like a Disney cartoon version of the Call Me By Your Name, kind of more of the gay representation in film. Disney queer codes stuff historically, which kind of means coding characters when authors couldn't simply write what their characters' identities were. Sometimes some people say it was for safety reasons, some people say it was for profit reasons.
Another thing to keep in mind with movies from like Disney, Marvel, those big international companies, is that those movies are being shown to international audiences. So something that may be okay to show as overtly queer in America might not necessarily be okay to show in like China or somewhere else that isn't as accepting of queer culture. But the idea of queer coding in media began with the introduction of the Hays Code in 1930, which specifically outlawed sexually suggestive content in film, including homosexuality. And although queerness wasn't allowed in films, writers and directors often made like slight allusions and references to queerness. With this came the idea of queer coding, which popular YouTube channel The Take defines as using LGBTQ plus tropes and stereotypes to allude to a character's sexuality without explicitly confirming it in the text. So as you can tell, it's pretty similar to queer baiting, the definition, but it's just a little more like overt. It's intended, but it isn't necessarily like directly saying that the relationship is queer, but it's using those stereotypes to kind of show queerness. But even after the end of the Hays Code, media continued to represent queerness in media without overtly admitting that relationships were actually queer.
And to kind of follow the examples of queer baiting and queer coding, something that's more recent is Stranger Things, the TV show. A lot of people were saying Will Byers was gay because of his what they thought was attraction to his best friend. And the actors Noah Schnapp and Millie Bobby Brown, said that kind of it's up to the audience's interpretation. So they never explicitly said that, you know, this character was gay. They just said it was up to the audience's interpretation, which could be kind of taken both ways controversially.
I think the big problem with queer baiting and what it boils down to is the fact that it's really frustrating for queer people to see art try to represent queerness, but when it boils down to it, they're not actually delivering representation. They're stopping just short of it and saying, like, oh, this character is queer, take it as you will, not directly coming out and saying it, but kind of leaving it up to people's interpretation instead of actually coming out and saying, like, we are proudly representing queer characters in our media. So in recent years, people have extended this term to individuals rather than characters. So celebrities, specific people, and saying that they are queer baiting or they are queer coding their art or their content. So people have accused a lot of people of alluding to these queer relationships in an attempt to bring in queer audiences without actually being queer or coming out as queer.
An example of this just recently is Kit Connor, who's the star of Heartstopper, which is a show that's very prominent in the LGBTQ community. He was accused of queerbaiting after he was seen in a heterosexual relationship, and he actually left Twitter for a little bit and then came back just to basically say, like, I'm bi, you guys forced me to come out, I'm only 18, this isn't okay, you missed the point of the show. And it was just an overall sad situation that shouldn't have happened.
On a little bit of a lighter note, Billie Eilish was recently criticized for her music video Lost Cause, where she depicted kind of an erotic sleepover with a group of women. She also came out on social media directly stating, "I love girls," and fans started calling her out because they thought she was exploiting queerness to expand her audience and convince people that she was queer without actually coming out. So her fans kind of were getting into arguments about that, whether or not she was allowed to use queerness in her art without actually being explicitly queer.
And then the last example for now of a celebrity who has also been accused of queerbaiting is Harry Styles. So this is a pretty big one because Harry Styles is pretty flamboyant with his fashion, with his personality and everything, but he's never explicitly said his sexuality. Now, because of that, a lot of people tend to accuse him of queerbaiting. While he's never explicitly said anything about his sexuality, he has said in magazine interviews, you know, it doesn't matter. It's about it's about not having a label to everything, not having to clarify what boxes you're checking, and he's just basically made a point of that's my private life. I shouldn't have to talk about it in public. That's not something for the public to know. It's the only piece of information I can keep to myself now that I'm so publicly out there. So given all that information that you guys just heard and have kind of listened to, what are your thoughts on all of this?
Well, I'm more on the camp of that I agree with what Harry Styles was saying as far as like private life. Just thinking about that actor that just had to come out as bisexual because he was pretty much forced to. That's not up to us to decide as an audience. That's like, I think we should take it as a piece of art that it is, and realize that these people aren't the characters that they're portraying. I mean, just thinking back on it, like Brokeback Mountain was a huge movie back in the day, and it was a film about two gay cowboys, and you know, it did great for the time being, and I don't remember that being a conversation of, oh, these two straight actors are playing gay cowboys. Like, why is that an issue? But it seems so much now that everybody's so down for being labeled that it kind of creates its own issues.
For sure. I think that being queer and queerness is very ambiguous in its nature, you know? It's really hard to, like, pin down those specific labels. And I think in recent times, there's been a lot of a push to be like, oh, you need to define yourself. And I think that's why queer is such a powerful label, because you don't necessarily have to come out as something specific, but I think it's important to keep in mind that there's a danger to being queer for a lot of people, and forcing somebody to come out or forcing that upon them, forcing them to come up with a label, I think is very anti-queer in its essence. Like, people are just they shouldn't be forced to have a label or a singular identity as a queer person.
And on the other hand, I feel like a lot of people they have to separate kind of like the actor from who they're actress from who they're playing. but I know a lot of people do like to see that representation when the actor or actress is playing the part, like they are queer as well. So that's a really big part of it, because like in Euphoria, Hunter is trans, and that's the character that she's playing on the show as well. So I think that means a lot to various people too.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point to make, is, as queer people, we do like to see queer representation, no matter what label. It doesn't matter. It could be transgender, bisexual, pansexual, just queer in general, asexual even. We like to see that representation in film and media. It would be nicer to see people who are those actual labels in, because then it's, promoting them and getting their voice out there. But at the same time, it's the fact that you have to separate the actor from the character. If the character is, a queer character, if they're playing a queer character, like for Kit Connor, he shouldn't have had to been forced to come out. And just because his character is bisexual doesn't mean that he has to come out as bisexual, because that could have been a safety thing for him. He's only 18.
Yeah, for sure. I think in the situation of Billie Eilish, I want to get your guys' opinion on that. Billie Eilish has never come out overtly as queer, but she depicts queerness in her art. So in that music video that we were referring to before, a lot of the discourse I've seen around this is that it's art. It's okay to depict queerness outside of having a queer label. What do you guys think about that?
There's definitely a line that it can be crossed. Artists have to be really specific with that, because I know there are also other artists who represent that community, but there's also some like controversy on if they're actually queer. Like an artist that I see a lot, this was like back in 2020 though, is Girl in Red. So her music is like revolved around like lesbian love and all that, but some people don't believe that she herself identifies as that, so you never really know. But at the same time, it shouldn't be forced upon the artist or the actor or the actress to come out. Like with like Harry Styles, obviously we've been seeing a lot of photos of him with like Olivia Wilde, so that's why that was like, I guess, backs up the proof of that he's not queer. But they don't owe us anything. Like, it's their lives, but it's just hard for them, obviously, because they're in they're public figures now.
That's an interesting point too, and definitely something I've struggled with in my own queerness, because I'm in a relationship with a man, and like to have somebody see you in like what appears to be a heterosexual relationship from the outside and be like, oh, that's anti-queer, or you're less queer because of that. Like, I don't know. I think that those assumptions that fans are making and seeing people in straight relationships, I know in Billie Eilish's case, they're like, oh, you have a boyfriend, so you can't be queer. But I don't think anybody owes us, like, proof that they're queer. Like, people shouldn't have to prove that they're a part of the community for you to see them as valid. And I don't even think they should have to come out or identify their label to be able to be a part of the community. But I think the bigger question is, do you have to identify as queer and come out as queer to have queerness in your art, or to talk about queerness?
I don't think so. I think it's still just art at the end of the day. And I mean, even if you're not queer, or even if Billie Eilish isn't queer, like, that doesn't mean that she doesn't know anybody that is queer. And for, let's say, Billie Eilish to have close friends that see like themselves represented in her artwork, that could mean something else too. It doesn't necessarily mean that just because the artist is or isn't queer, like, they can't celebrate what it means to be part of the LGBT community.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Kind of going off of the whole being in a quote unquote heterosexual relationship while you're still being queer. I think a lot of the stuff that people don't realize with these celebrities like Billie Eilish or Harry Styles, who have been accused of queerbaiting even though they've been in, only publicly seen with heterosexual relationships, is there are labels where you can be with, a man and be a woman, or you could be with a woman and still be a man, but you could still be considered queer, because pansexual, bisexual, stuff like that, that doesn't necessarily mean, like, if you say you're queer, it doesn't mean, oh, I'm a woman, I only like women, or oh, I'm a man, I only like men. Like, no, you can still be queer, you can still have that fluidity, you can still be willing to, basically love who you love. It doesn't matter who it is. And I think that's something that people kind of forget with these celebrities, is they think that they're automatically queer baiting just because they're seen with the opposite gender. And that's not always the case because of these labels. And I think sometimes, I mean, I've seen on social media, a lot of times it comes down to biphobia, which is like not acknowledging that bi people are queer people. Because if, like, for instance, I'm queer and I've gone between different labels like pansexual and bisexual, but I've always been in a heterosexual relationship with men. But it doesn't mean that I'm not queer. I still am. It doesn't matter. It's just because I've just never been seen like that. Doesn't mean I still have, like, it doesn't mean I don't have an attraction to the opposite sex or a non-binary person or a transgender person. That's just who I am. That's who I've been with so far. And so I think that's something that's important for other people to realize with these celebrities. It doesn't always come down to just being in a heterosexual relationship.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
It's just odd to me that a community that's so focused on fluidity and truly accepting who you really are is forcing people into such strict boxes and labels. Like, if you're actually being true to who you are, like, humans are so much more nuanced than like a label or a category. Like, to force people to come out as one thing or identify themselves as one thing is just kind of, it just really doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't truly represent, like, the way a lot of queer people actually represent themselves.
And that's why there's such a, like, big spectrum, you know? Like, I know people, people who aren't in the community, they kind of misunderstand. Like, an example would be being bisexual. Like, they automatically think it's like 50-50 when that's not how it is. It is this whole spectrum, and it's completely up to you. Like, intersectionalities, you could be like bisexual, pan, but you could also be, there's all these terms that are part of the LGBTQ plus community. You can be pansexual, bisexual, and also be like demisexual, you know what I mean? Which, if people don't know, is someone who they have to be, how would you say, in order to have like sexual relations, you have to like have a romantic connection with someone. But yeah, it's just this whole thing about intersectionalities and all this, the whole spectrum. It's really important.
I think a recent acceptance of intersectionality and understanding that has definitely allowed for more fluidity, because people can be like, as you were saying, like, they can be pan, they can be poly, but they can also be ace. And like, there are so many different labels that you can use, which is helpful in like actually defining yourself. But sometimes, like, using the queer label and just not really having to explain yourself or justify the person you are, I think is also a really powerful aspect of being queer.
And I feel like it's up to you with your experience, like when you come out, when you don't, like whatever you're comfortable with. Because I remember when, I feel like we're constantly changing, because you have to like, well, you don't certainly have to like experience those things first to like come out and say what you are or what you identify as. Because there's the term of, you know, bi-curious. Like, how would you say you're bi-curious? Does that mean like you've experimented already, or like you're curious about it and then you will experiment? Because like when I first came out, I thought I was like bisexual, and then I had like my first relationship with a girl, and then at first I was like, okay, wait, I still like men more though. And then it switched as that relationship progressed. And then I was like, oh wait, no, I like women more. And then I was like, wait, but what if I'm a lesbian? And then, but that word never, like, I don't really identify myself as that. So I would be like okay with saying gay more, just because, I don't know, that felt more comfortable to me. So now, obviously, I don't like labels, or I'm constantly changing. So I just say queer because it's like the easiest thing. That's why it's such a good like umbrella term.
Yeah, and I think adding on to that, another big thing with the whole label situation is I've heard so many times people say, especially my family, I've got a couple of family members that, you know, support me, and it's great to have, but so many times they say, you know, the label shouldn't matter. I don't care what your label is. I'm just happy you're being you. I'm happy you're open. I just want to get to a point where your label, like, nobody should have to ask you, like, what's your label? Like, are you bisexual? Are you pansexual? Are you gay? Are you lesbian? Like, it shouldn't matter what other people are forcing you to think, forcing you to say, because you could be unlabeled. If you go between label to label, I've gone to where I was unlabeled for a little bit, because you, as a queer person, when you first come out and start experimenting, you kind of go through these phases of trying to understand who you are. You might even do it before you come out, and just trying to understand who you are, what your label should be. But I think it's also important to realize, you could do queer, you could say unlabeled, you could just say, you know, I'm not sure, I'm still figuring myself out. That shouldn't be something, you don't owe that to anybody. You don't owe telling other people what your sexuality is, what your gender identity is. That is not something you owe other people. It's something you just have to figure out for yourself. And I feel like the same go with celebrities. It's like they're human, they're people, and that's something that kind of flies over everybody's head. They're still people. They're not fictitious. They're still people, and they can be fluid with themselves. They're still figuring out who they are. It doesn't matter how old they are. They're still figuring out who they are, figuring out what they want to be, figuring out who they're attracted to, what their identity is. That's them. Yeah.
And to force that very private process onto a public stage is just unfair to what the process even is. It's a very personal thing, and even if they have queerness in their art, even if they allude to queerness, I understand that there is a very historical issue with portraying queerness in media, but we talked about separating the art from the artist, and we can take issue with the fact that sometimes it's being used disrespectfully and as a marketing tactic, but I think we need to look at the way queerness has been in media before now and understand that even if Billie Eilish isn't queer, even if Harry Styles hasn't come out as queer and has queer things in his music, that's a step towards representation. There are a lot of people who have not seen queerness in media. They don't even know what queerness is. And I know in my case, like, I hadn't seen queer relationships in music and media, and that made it even harder to understand my own labels. So I think we should be appreciating queerness in media, and we shouldn't be policing who can include queerness in media. I just think it's really important to keep in mind that figuring out who you are and what your sexuality is a very abstract process, and it's very fluid, and to force somebody to come out seems very anti-queer and against everything that the LGBTQ plus community typically stands for.
Exactly.
Awesome.
And I mean, like, I'm very comfortable with like my labels myself, and I know like what I'm attracted to, but I never discuss that. And it's partly because, one, I don't want to have that argument. I don't have that conversation because that's not for you to know. Like, that doesn't matter. At the end of the day, I'm still me. Like, I'm not going to change anything about me. But sometimes it's just a little bit easier to avoid having that annoying conversation where you're just like, well, are you really like part of the community? I'm like, does it matter? Like, honestly, it doesn't. So I think for like, you know, like Harry Styles to just be himself, like, it doesn't matter. Like, at the end of the day, like, if he is queer, if he isn't, like, what's that going to change for you? Are you going to stop listening to his music just because he won't tell you? Like, that you're taking the artist and making it something that it shouldn't be.
Yeah, that's a really good point, mentioning the fact that, like, the person's not going to change. I mean, they might have a different word hanging over their head because let's say they came out and chose a label, like Harry Styles. If he says, you know what, I'm bisexual, I'm gay, that doesn't change anything because he's been like that ever since. It's like he's been like that his entire life. That doesn't change anything. The same with if a queer person was to come out to a family member or something. It's like they've been the same person that you've seen your entire life. However long you've known them, they're still the same person. It's just it's a word. It's that label, but they're still the same. It just depends on, going back to like what I said, it depends on how they want to feel comfortable in their own skin. I think that's a really good point.
And if like these actors and actresses, all these creators, like if they're not part of the community, they're still representing it, and that's like a really important part for the LGBTQ plus community, because they could just be allies as well, and that's still representation.
Much better than a lot of the representation we were getting like 10 years ago, where creators were laughing at the notion of actually including queerness in media. So I mean, a lot of people are being criticized, but in the end, I think that any kind of representation towards the queer community that puts it in a positive light is a pretty good step towards actually making sure that we have representation in media and that young queer people are seeing themselves in the things that they watch and consume.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much for coming on today.
Of course,
We're
it was a
really
pleasure.
happy to talk to you, and we'll talk to you guys and talk to more members of the queer community on the next episode of Shamelessly Relevant.
Thank you guys
Thank
as
you.
well.